Everyone calls Venezuela a narco-state. Politicians say it, headlines repeat it, sanctions cite it, the term is everywhere, but almost no one asks the next question: who profits when we use that word? Because here's what's strange. The more the label gets used, the more the behavior it describes seems to intensify. Seizures go up, indictments multiply, migration surges, and the very networks Washington says it wants to dismantle, they get stronger. So is narco-state an evidence-based diagnosis of Venezuela's power structure, or is it a political label that shapes outcomes? What if the story survives not because of what's proven in court, but because it creates incentives for Washington, for Caracas, for rivals, for intermediaries to behave in predictable, profitable ways? That's what this episode is about. We're going to walk the evidence ladder, we're going to map the incentive machine, and by the end, you'll see why the most important question isn't whether Venezuela is a narco-state, it's what calling it one actually does. Let's start where the story always starts, with a word. 130 frame. The label goes mainstream. The term narco-state isn't new. It's been thrown at Colombia in the 1980s, at Afghanistan, at Guinea-Bissau. But in Venezuela's case, it entered mainstream US policy vocabulary around 2015 and became doctrine by 2020. Visual, split-screen montage, congressional hearings, think tank reports, news chyrons, all showing narco-state in bold. Here's how it works. A term starts as intelligence jargon, then it migrates into congressional testimony, then into sanctions language, then into court filings, and finally into common usage where it becomes self-evident. No one questions it anymore, it just is. But let's be precise. What does narco-state actually mean? In theory, it describes a government whose core institutions, military, intelligence, executive branch, are systematically involved in drug trafficking. Not isolated corruption, not a few bad actors, but a state-run operation where narcotics revenue funds the regime and the regime protects the traffickers. That's a specific claim. It requires specific evidence. And the weird thing, the more you look for that evidence, the murkier it gets. Starting in 2020, the US Department of Justice unsealed indictments against senior Venezuelan officials, including the sitting head of state. The charges: narco-terrorism, cocaine trafficking conspiracy, weapons trafficking. The language was dramatic, the allegations were sweeping, but here's what most people miss. An indictment is not a conviction. It's a legal filing that says, we believe we have enough to charge you. It reflects intelligence assessments, cooperating witness testimony, and investigative conclusions. It does not require a trial, cross-examination, or a guilty verdict. This isn't a technicality. It's the foundation of how we assess evidence. Courts demand proof beyond reasonable doubt. Intelligence agencies work in probabilities. And policy works in narratives. So when the label narco-state enters policy, it doesn't need courtroom-level proof. It just needs to be useful. And that's where things get interesting. Because the moment that word appears in a sanctions order or a State Department brief, it changes reality. It cuts off legal trade. It freezes assets. It isolates a government. And in doing so, it creates the conditions that make illicit trade more profitable. But here's what changes. The moment that word enters a courtroom, the burden of proof goes up, way up. All 330 acti, the evidence ladder. Let's talk about what we actually know and what we're told we know. The evidence for Venezuela as a narco-state exists on several levels. Let's call it the evidence ladder. Bottom rung, geography. Venezuela shares a 1,400-mile border with Colombia, the world's largest cocaine producer. It has a Caribbean coastline full of isolated coves. It has weak radar coverage, minimal Coast Guard presence, and a collapsing economy that makes smuggling one of the few reliable income sources. This is corridor logic. Traffickers don't need ideology. They need three things: proximity to supply, access to routes, and minimal interdiction risk. Venezuela checks all three boxes. Does that make it a narco-state? No. It makes it a corridor, like Guinea-Bissau, like parts of Central America. Geography creates opportunity. Opportunity attracts criminals. But that's not the same as state coordination. Second rung, corruption. There's no serious debate that Venezuelan officials, military, customs, judiciary are involved in facilitating drug flows. The question is, how and how much? Is it centralized? Is there a chain of command from the presidential palace to the airstrip? Or is it decentralized? Hundreds of local actors taking bribes, providing protection, and operating semi-independently. The narco-state label implies the former top-down control. But a lot of the evidence points to the latter, a corruption market where officials don't need orders, they just need a price and a guarantee of impunity. A visual map of Venezuela with scattered dots representing border checkpoints, airstrips, ports, some lit up, some dark, suggesting fragmented control. Third rung, legal filings. The 2020 U.S. indictments allege that senior officials coordinated with armed groups, specifically Colombia's FARC, dissidents, and ELN, to move cocaine through Venezuelan territory. They allege protection payments. They allege military aircraft used for transport. They cite cooperating witnesses, intercepted communications, and financial trails. This is serious, but it's also unproven in court. None of the indicted officials have faced trial. Some are in hiding. Some govern from Caracas. The U.S. has offered $15 million rewards for information leading to arrests. Here's the problem. In the absence of trials, we're left with allegations. And allegations, however detailed, are not the same as convictions. Does that mean the allegations are false? Not necessarily. It means we don't know, at least not with the certainty that the term narco-state implies. Top-rung convictions. As of 2025, a small number of individuals connected to Venezuela, some officials, some intermediaries, have been convicted in U.S. courts on drug-related charges. These convictions are real. They prove complicity in trafficking networks, but they don't prove state coordination. They prove that some people with Venezuelan passports and government positions were involved in drug smuggling. That's corruption. That could even be systemic corruption. But is it a narco-state? The latter matters, because the higher you climb, the thinner the evidence gets, and yet the label is used as if we're standing at the top. So if the evidence is ambiguous, why does the label stick so well? Section 2, geography as infrastructure. Let's zoom in on how this actually works on the ground, because the mechanics tell a different story than the headlines. Venezuela's border with Colombia is not a line on a map. It's a 1,400-mile economic zone where the formal economy collapsed and the shadow economy took over. Here's what moves through that border. Gasoline. Venezuela subsidizes fuel to absurdly low prices, pennies per gallon. Colombian smugglers buy it by the tanker truck and resell it across the border at 100x markup. Gold. Illegal mining operations in Venezuela's southern states produce billions in gold smuggled out through Colombia and Brazil. Arms, weapons flow both ways. Into Venezuela for armed groups, out of Venezuela for military stockpiles. Cocaine. Produced in Colombia, moved through Venezuela, shipped from coastal ports, or flown from clandestine airstrips. Visual. Animated sequence showing the same dirt road with multiple cargo types passing through fuel truck, gold bars and backpacks, weapons crates, cocaine bricks, all using the same route. These aren't separate networks. They're the same logistics infrastructure, the same smugglers, the same protectors, the same border checkpoints where the same officials take the same bribes. This is what analysts call a border economy. It's not centrally planned. It's opportunistic, it's adaptive, and it's incredibly resilient because it operates in a vacuum of state capacity. The Venezuelan military isn't running cocaine labs, but local commanders control checkpoints. They tax the traffic, they provide protection. Some of them actively participate. Others just look the other way for cash. Is this a narco-state? Or is it a fragmented state where criminal governance filled the gaps? Here's the distinction. A narco-state implies the government depends on drug revenue. A narco-economy implies criminal networks depend on state weakness. The evidence suggests the second is closer to reality. Venezuela's government gets most of its revenue from oil when prices are high and from creative monetary policy, printing money, selling gold reserves. Cocaine is a border phenomenon, not a fiscal foundation. But, and this is key, calling it a narco-state has consequences because the label triggers a policy response. And that policy response changes the incentives for everyone involved, which brings us to the most dangerous part, the incentive loop no one talks about. 0830 ACT3, the incentive machine. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because once you map the incentives, you start to see how the narco-state label doesn't just describe a problem, it creates one. Let's walk through the logic. Step 1, sanctions pressure. When the U.S. labels Venezuela a narco-state and imposes sanctions, it cuts off legal trade. Oil exports drop, banking access disappears, imports collapse, the formal economy contracts. Step 2, illicit trade margins rise. When legal trade shrinks, illicit trade becomes more profitable. Smuggling fuel, gold, and cocaine now accounts for a bigger share of the remaining economic activity. The shadow economy grows. Step 3. Criminal governance strengthens. As formal state presence weakens, armed groups and trafficking networks step in. They become the de facto authorities in border zones. They provide jobs. They settle disputes. They tax commerce. This is the feedback loop. Sanctions, no economic collapse. State retreat. Criminal governance, nor trafficking. And here's the twist. This loop benefits multiple actors. For Washington, the label justifies maximum pressure. Every seizure, every indictment, every record bust becomes evidence that the strategy is working, even if total flows don't decrease. For Caracas, the siege mentality strengthens internal control. External enemies unify the base, and the government can blame sanctions for economic failure, even when corruption plays a role. For traffickers, higher margins, weaker interdiction, more chaos. Chaos is good for smuggling. Predictability is the enemy. For intermediaries, lawyers, fixers, logistics operators, financial facilitators, everyone in the middle charges more when routes are illegal and risky. Visual, split screen showing a U.S. Coast Guard drug seizure press conference on one side and a clandestine speedboat launching at dusk on the other, both happening simultaneously. This is what I call the incentive machine. Everyone has a reason for the system to continue. Stopping it would require all actors to change behavior simultaneously. But they won't, because they're not playing the same game. Consider the displacement effect. When the US and Colombia crack down on one route, traffickers don't stop. They shift from the Pacific to the Caribbean, from Venezuela's coast to Suriname, from airdrops to submarine drones. Interdiction agencies tout seizures as victories, and they are successes. Individual shipments stopped, individual networks disrupted. But from a systems perspective, they're also advertising. Every bust tells other traffickers, don't use that route, use this one instead. And that brings us to migration. Between 2015 and 2025, over 7 million Venezuelans fled the country. That's one of the largest displacement crises in modern history. Why? Economic collapse, hyperinflation, food scarcity, lack of medical care, and yes, insecurity, violence from armed groups, extortion, kidnapping. But here's the feedback. Migration flows become a political tool. Host countries, Colombia, Peru, Chile, the US, face domestic pressure over immigration. That pressure gets linked back to Venezuela as a source of instability, which reinforces the narco-state narrative, which justifies more sanctions, which worsens conditions, which drives more migration. The loop closes. And that's when you realize the label isn't describing the problem, it's funding it. 11 say AT4, 2 interpretations, 1 reality. So let's be honest. There are 2 strong ways to read this situation, and both have evidence. Interpretation A, high-level collusion is real. The consistency of protection, the scale of operations, the involvement of senior officials, it's too systematic to be random. The intelligence is credible. The witnesses are real. The financial trails exist. The narco-state label, whatever its political utility, explains how these networks survive despite immense pressure. Under this view, calling it a narco-state is accurate. And the policy response, isolation, sanctions, indictments, is justified. The goal is to make the cost of complicity unbearable. Interpretation B, the label is a simplification that drives policy. The reality is messier, decentralized corruption, border militias, opportunistic networks, and geographic inevitability. The term narco-state flattens this complexity into a single villain. It enables maximum pressure policies that may not reduce trafficking, but do increase human suffering and empower the very criminal networks they target. Under this view, the label is weaponized, and the policy response creates the conditions it claims to fight. Visual side-by-side images on the left, a legal document with indictment stamped on the right, a jungle airstrip at dusk with a plane's shadow. So, which is true? Here's the uncomfortable answer. Both. Corruption and complicity are real. Senior officials have been credibly accused. Networks operate with protection. That's not propaganda. It's documented. But the label also serves political ends. It justifies policies that have predictable effects, economic devastation, displacement, and the empowerment of illicit actors. The evidence ladder matters. So do the incentives. And so does the human cost. Because while policymakers in Washington and Caracas debate narratives, the people living on that 1,400-mile border are stuck in the middle. They're not narco-state actors or sanctions regime casualties. They're farmers, drivers, shopkeepers, trying to survive in a place where the formal economy disappeared, and the shadow economy is the only game left. And here's what history tells us. When you create conditions where crime is the most rational choice, you don't get less crime. You get more. You just get it in different forms, under different protections, with different routes. That's the paradox. The harder you squeeze, the more the system adapts. 13 conclusion. The question isn't, is it true? It's what does it do? So let's come back to the question we started with. Is narco-state an evidence-based diagnosis or a political label? The answer, it's both. And that's precisely what makes it so powerful. It's grounded in enough reality to be defensible, and it's vague enough to be flexible. It's a diagnosis that becomes a policy tool, and a policy tool that reshapes reality. Here's what we know for certain. Cocaine moves through Venezuela in large quantities. Officials are involved, some at high levels. The border economy runs on smuggling. Sanctions have intensified economic collapse. Migration has surged. Trafficking networks have adapted and in many cases grown stronger. What we don't know, at least not with courtroom certainty, is whether this constitutes centralized state coordination or decentralized opportunistic corruption. The evidence ladder is incomplete. The trials haven't happened. The convictions are partial. But here's the thing. In policy, certainty is a luxury. Decisions get made on probabilities, narratives, and political imperatives. The narco-state label works because it simplifies. It gives clarity in a situation that's anything but clear. And that's the danger. Because when a label becomes policy and policy creates incentives, and incentives drive behavior, you end up in a world where the diagnosis and the disease are impossible to separate. Visual, slowly zoom out from a redacted document to reveal a wider map with movement arrows. Flows don't stop, they just shift. So the question isn't, is Venezuela a narco-state? The question is, what does calling it one actually do? Does it weaken trafficking networks or displace them? Does it pressure corrupt officials or entrench them? Does it protect regional security or destabilize borders? Does it reduce drug flows to the US or just change the routes? These are empirical questions. They have answers, but they require looking past the label and into the mechanics, into the incentives, into the unintended consequences, because here's the final uncomfortable truth. If the goal is to reduce cocaine flows, there's little evidence that the current approach is working. Seizures go up, indictments multiply, the narrative intensifies, but cocaine still reaches US cities. Prices stay low. Purity stays high, which means one of two things is true. Either the strategy hasn't been given enough time and resources to work, or the strategy is solving the wrong problem. Maybe the real question isn't, how do we stop Venezuela from being a narco-state? Maybe it's how do we reduce drug demand, improve border governance, and create legal economic alternatives in a region where the shadow economy is the only economy left. That's harder. It's slower. It doesn't fit on a chyron, but it might actually work. So here's my challenge to you. The next time you see the term narco-state in a headline, ask 3 questions. What's the evidence and what level of the ladder is it on? Who benefits from using this term right now? What would the world look like if the label were wrong? And what would it look like if it were right? Because the truth, as always, is in the complexity, and the stakes, human, political, regional, are too high to settle for slogans. CTA? Comment below. Is narco-state a diagnosis or a weaponized label? And what would count as real proof for you? Let's map this together. If this changed how you see the issue, subscribe. Next episode, we're diving into the sanctions mechanics, how financial pressure works, who it actually hurts, and why it's nearly impossible to reverse once it starts. Thanks for watching. And remember, the most dangerous lies aren't the ones that are completely false. They're the ones that are partially true.